Psychotechnologies Live. Welcome to a very special episode of Psychotechnologies Live. We have with us a very special guest, Brendan Graham Dempsey. He's a writer, host of Metamodern Spirituality podcast, Sky Meadow Retreats, who he runs, I believe, with Layman. And also, I just see him all the time on Facebook, so I kind of just wanted to get to know him and see what he's all about. We're gonna talk today about heterodox psychotechnologies, including a very obscure one called reading. So, Brendan, what is a heterodox psychotechnology, or what is that? Is that a class of things?
Well, I just say heterodox because heterodox is the opposite of orthodox. So if you're thinking about, I don't know, what would be an orthodox psychotechnology? I mean, that's such a sexy term. It's a sexy phrase, a psychotechnology, and when I think people hear that, they think meditation, they think, I don't know, therapeutic hallucinogens or something like that, something a bit more in that domain. So when I say heterodox psychotechnologies, I guess I just mean something a little bit so mainstream that you don't even think about it as a psychotechnology. But I want to make the case for why actually I think some things that might be interpreted or misinterpreted as rather mundane are actually really profound, crucial, important spiritual practices. And so when I say heterodox psychotechnology, I mean something hiding in plain sight, maybe, that might be really profound for a spiritual path.
Is this like authority? We just assume that some people are more authority than others. Like, we follow orders when the government tells us to do stuff. That's like, whoa, how did they get me to do it? Wow, crazy.
No, not like that. That'll not be what I'm talking about. If you're saying like it's not, certainly not rote behavior is not in the mix, if that's what you're asking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's like normal stuff that we do every day, but we don't notice we're doing it, and so you're bringing.
No, I don't know. I mean, so what I'm getting at here is I guess so. I can kind of set this up a little bit. I think that might be the best way to. Yeah. Okay. So the way that I engage my spiritual practice and my framing of the universe and my meta narrative and all that stuff, right, is I think of the universe as undergoing a cosmic learning process. And I wrote about this in this book I put out called Emergentism, in which I kind of present this vision for a complexifying universe that is engaged in an ongoing learning process, coming to greater and greater self-knowledge. And I draw very much on the work of Bobby Azarian, another metamodern thinker, and Greg Enriquez, a metamodern theorist, and Hansi Freinacht, and other metamodern theorists and thinkers, and other traditions as well, which we can talk about. But for me, this has been the culmination point for kind of my spiritual trajectory over 20 years or plus, and so it's about an unfolding complexification through learning that the universe is doing. And I can talk about that, but it goes, from matter into life, into minded animals with nervous systems, and then into cultural people. And people are cultural persons like us are the only ones that we know of, though there may very well be others out in the cosmos, who have symbolic, linguistic, mediated information processing, like what we're doing right now, talking through our mouth holes and understanding each other through symbols, right? So this is how humans especially learn, by processing information that is symbolic and linguistic in nature. But we're also learning, we're part of this complexification process generally. So we are also living organisms. So we have a genetic code in us that's kind of a inherited learning pattern. We have brains and nervous systems, right? So we have that kind of experiential, what you might call kind of neuronal information processing going on. And that's memory that's stored in our bodies. We have reflexes and all that sort of stuff. But then we also have this symbolic language component to our learning, and that is kind of uniquely human. So anyway, all of these things are part of a cosmic process that's been unfolding for 13.8 billion years. It's the story, it's the big story of the universe. And so I kind of contextualize my spiritual framework in that way. So for me, learning is a spiritual practice. And I don't think that is such a radical idea. I mean, philosophy was very much a way of being. It was a spiritual practice, you could say, in the ancient world, and the love of wisdom, the love of knowledge, the love of learning, that sort of a thing. So anyway, so to tie it all together, that's the kind of big framework here. And so for me, if that's how I'm looking at kind of the drive, the story, the purpose even of the entire universe, of gaining more and more knowledge ultimately about itself, because it's one thing, and we're part of that, we're participating in it, then learning is a spiritual process. And so if you engage in the learning process in any number of ways, I think that you're engaging in a spiritual process. So for me, reading books, learning, acquiring new knowledge, acquiring new skills, acquiring new, shifting your horizons, mental horizons, all that stuff, I think of as spiritual practices. So that's what I mean by it's kind of a heterodox. You probably, in a psychotechnology context, people don't say, come on this channel and say, reading books, that's what I'm all about. But that's what I want to try to make the case for here.
I get it. I get reading as a magical experience. They're often black squiggles on a white page, and I point my eyes at them, and then I have some kind of experience. I like float off into a fantasy land, or I draw a mental construct, or I do a whole lot in relation to the words on the page. Is that what you mean?
That's part of what I mean, but it's more than that, because it's not just the process. Actually, to be totally honest with you, I wouldn't even say, some people love reading, the act of reading. They get lost in a novel. I've never really been quite like that. But what I do love is learning and growing in my mind. And so, for me, it's not so much about even the act. It's about the other end of this process. It's fulfilling a particular, in some ways you could call it a kind of ritual that leaves you on the other end of that ritual more fulfilled, more robust, more, engaging more in viability and flourishing and growth. And so it's not just like, oh, I'm sitting in front of these pages and I'm having this sort of, hallucinogenic experience by having all these images flying in my brain. It's more like, wow, I just learned, that this and by the way, this doesn't have to just be reading, but let's say I'll use a different example. A few hours ago, I saw a 3D model of the ATP construction that goes on in a cell, like in the mitochondria, and like this little like, chemical machine churning out, energy basically in the cell. And I'm like, and now I have that image in my head. And so I'm different now than I was a few hours before I saw that. And that has added to my whole mental construct. It's in a minor way, but an important way, has refashioned my mental model of reality. I've gained something, right? So that's what I'm talking about in the broadest sense, but reading does that, and it happens all over the place. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this definitely resonates for sure. The like to reflect a little bit, you're looking at the mundane acts that are kind of like the basis of psychotechnologies in a way, where it's like just like that learning process itself. And then you give the example of the images of the videos and of the books, which you're calling hallucinogenic. And like, I think that's 100% right. You do read a book and then you start to imagine all these things. Or like even now I'm listening to you and I started like feeling different and imagining things are just like showing up in my head, right? It's like kind of like drugs, but it's like more background than foreground, where I think the drugs tend to want to bring that to the foreground.
Yeah, I mean, and drugs can play a part in this too, smoking some marijuana or cannabis, whatever you want to call it, and then doing this, leads to different kinds of results, and certain aspects of the memory engage differently, or certain levels of engagement are triggered in different ways. There's a certain, neurophysiological chemistry going on there. But ultimately, I mean, yeah, I want to kind of frame learning as a psychotechnology that is really one of the most important across the different media, because you could also say too, right? Like you could have an incredible state experience. Like I'm in a state of euphoria, or I've done some drug, or I've been meditating for 6 hours and then X happens, right? But if you don't have a mental space to interpret that, in accord with, let's say, its maximal potential, then you could ask the question, what have you really gained from that? You can have euphoric experiences, you can have transcendental insights, but then if you're sort of like left at the other end of that in terms of like, yeah, that was really interesting, that was odd, that was profound, that was sublime, now what, right? And I think that what the complementary aspect to those sorts of things is like a learning regimen, where you're able to then contextualize these experiences of profundity in a way that you can ground also in rational structures, but also trans-rational structures. I mean, even being able to talk about rational and trans-rational structures, and maybe pre-rational structures, and appreciating all these different possibilities, right? Like that's a consequence of a learning process. So being able to reframe your own frameworks is a form of metacognition that is afforded by learning, which in its own way, meditation and other kinds of psychotechnologies also provide. If you do certain mind-altering substances and you get a new sense of what is possible for consciousness, you have this thing to compare your normal waking consciousness to then be like, oh, I can compare this to this, and now you can kind of get some metacognitive kind of distance from it and be like, oh wow, so it's not just this, it's this, right? And I think that learning does the exact same thing in a different way, but they're very deeply complementary, and they ultimately kind of weave into each other. So I would also, to kind of use a phrase that John Vervaeke uses, talking about ecologies of practices, right? I'm not at all saying that like reading books and learning things is the only thing that you should be doing. Certainly not, right? But like it certainly will deepen other kinds of psychotechnological practices that are going on. Yeah.
That's super cool. I want to like zoom in a little bit on this learning as a psychotechnology, and then you talked about like you sort of like hinted to frameworks, I guess, without going like specifically into them. Do you like this is what I'm interested in right now, is like do you have like, what frameworks do you use for cognition? Like I guess you use precognition, cognition, metacognition. Are you using like Keegan models, or are you using something else?
Definitely
Like,
Keegan. I mean, developmental psychology is huge. I swim in that terrain. Piaget, Keegan, Kohlberg, Commons, all the C names, and others. I mean, I've been doing a deep dive into developmental psychology lately, so that's sort of particularly on my mind. I also, the work of Ken Wilber and Hansi Freinacht in employing those kinds of meta-theoretical, developmentally informed frameworks is really important. But evolution of consciousness in general is crucial for all this, and that brings in the Jungians and people like Eric Neumann, and of course Jung himself and others. So the evolution of consciousness itself, I think, is actually a really great example, right? Because this is sort of the classic metacognitive subject matter, is when cognition or consciousness sort of turns back and starts looking at itself, like, where did I come from? What am I? What's going on here? How am I thinking these thoughts, right? Thinking about thinking is like a sort of recursive thing that opens up new. It's like you kind of see around the corner and you're like, oh, there's stuff going on here, and then you get these kinds of mental upgrades or something, where you're able to be like, oh, there are deeper layers and levels to all this stuff going on,
or downgrades, depending on how you do it.
Certainly. And I mean, that's a whole other topic happy to get into, but like the misapplication or the misconstrual and misunderstanding of consciousness and developmental models of the psyche abound and are dangerous and really potentially deeply regressive. So it's there be dragons here. But ultimately, I think that if you can integrate that stuff in a meaningful way, and again, this is actually really it, right? Because it's like, the best hedge against not misapplying these sorts of models is to go deep into them, right? To read deeply. So it's like, okay, so you read Ken Wilber, let's say, or you read Transformations of Consciousness or whatever it is, and you're like, wow, this is wild. Or you read Robert Keegan, let's just say, and then you're like, this is a whole game changer. Well, you don't stop there. You're like, well, where did this guy come from? Then you realize that he was a student at Harvard and studied with Kohlberg, and Kohlberg was working off of Piaget. And then you try to read all of Piaget and Kohlberg and Commons and the Neo-Piagetians and all this stuff. And then when you do that, you have like a framework for being able to understand that stuff better. And I want to drive that home, because it's like, this is the work that needs to be done, unless you're going to like go off the rails potentially with some of this stuff, because it's sort of like when you explore esotericism, right? It's sort of like, this can be very dangerous if you don't have the right framing, the support for it, the ritualistic framing, whatever you want to call it, shamanistic framing. You want to be able to ground these things and contextualize them in meaningful ways for people, so that they don't apply and abuse them, basically. But this stuff is rife, because this is precisely what people don't do. They don't do, you could say, the reading. You could call it the homework. It doesn't have to be reading. I mean, there are videos, there's all this stuff, courses.
It's like they don't do the heterodox.
Yeah, I mean, that's a sexy way I've spun this, right? But it's like, it's sort of like in forms of Christian mysticism. There's who was it? I forget at the moment, but like
Aquinas?
People would no, it was someone more recent. They were talking about doing the dishes as a sacred act. They were talking about like scrubbing the floors. It was Dorothy Day maybe, or someone like that, and scrubbing the floors, doing this sort of like, and not just in a service sense, but like that there's something deep in just the mundane, quote unquote, realities that are very profound. And it's sort of like, ultimately you're like, oh wow, that's where a lot of this stuff is. And so I guess in a maybe rhetorical turn, but maybe not, maybe a little bit more or less than that, I want to frame some of these psychotechnologies in that way, because I think that they're really crucial. And if we don't have that, then it's like you find a lot of state chasers, right? People who are looking for like profound, mystical, sublime experiences, and they'll do high dose substances and all this stuff. And then are they any wiser? Yeah, exactly. And that's important too for like your journey and stuff. But it's also like, are people wiser on the other end of that? Have they learned much more? Are they kinder, better people? Have they really gained insight or wisdom? Right. And then you have to ask, well, what would it take to really have that? And then I would say you have to sink into things. You've got to like spend time. You've got to direct your attention, not just on a meditation object, but on like rational constructs, and like learn and read and grow. So anyway, I'm rambling, but yeah, that's sort of the gist of it.
A little, but it was fun. That's so cool. I think they call it in Toronto, we call it dishing or something, where it's like doing the dishes. And there's these like people here, they live in, I'm really supposed to talk about it on the web, but like they would live in the house together, and then they would like open the drawer and just talk about how is everything arranged, and just like sort of doing like the mundane everyday life, but doing that in an intentional way. And they're looking at more like cooperative and like in connection with each other. And so like what does the system want? What are the other people coming together?
Yeah.
Moving into, I think like the thing that's like sticking out to me is, I guess, like this like learning process is sort of where you seem like really into like contextualizing things, learning processes, and then like the I guess the mundane everyday stuff. Learning is not something we've really talked about so much on
that's what I'm saying, right? That's why it's interesting. Who talks about learning as a psychotechnology? That's the case I'm trying to make to you, is like this is like crucial stuff. It's like bread and butter stuff. Anyway, I interrupted, but this is
I think you're 100%
question, like, what is learning? Like,
so like Yeah, like what is like, yeah, I guess like what is learning, if you can answer
What is
that,
learning?
and if not,
Yeah.
what are like the fundamental, like most important parts of it?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So this would be one way of framing it, and then we can blow this up and zoom in and do whatever. But one way of thinking about it is it seems to be the case, let's take as a starting point, that like there's something like an entity in a context. There are things and there are the spaces in which they exist, right? Broadly speaking, these are categories that we can talk about. And so basically, and now I can get into this in some depth because learning itself actually evolves and complexifies actually over cosmic history. But one basic sense of what learning is that these entities that exist in their environments need to be able to navigate those environments in such a way that allows them to persist. Otherwise they won't, and then they won't be things in environments. It'll just be the environment, right? So there's sort of like
We'll be
this
able
is
to
like where
study
it
it to
all
create
comes
one.
down to, like you can ultimately like bring it all back here. Now, if that's successful, what's really going on there is basically that there's a tying of information between this entity and their environment. There's you can frame this statistically through information theory and stuff like that. But basically there's like what's called mutual information between these two things. And that ultimately what information aids that entity in its continued survival or existence or persistence, however you want to frame that, in an entropic universe, which is sort of always necessarily going to be sort of a threat to the continued persistence of the information of that entity continuing. That which is viability enhancing or leads to the flourishing of that entity in that context is necessary for that thing to persist and then navigate its environment. And that is basically the core of learning. So whatever information about an environment, including the thing itself, which it's kind of interestingly, recursively relating to and kind of self-modeling, that information is relevant to that entity. It is existentially relevant to that entity. And so there is inherent like meaning about this kind of information to things. And what's very fascinating about when you can frame it this way, you can actually say that this process is going on, right now, and going back all the way through the entire eons of cosmic evolution, all the way down to cells and even before cells, and that's a topic we don't have to get into, but basically there are different kinds of learning. So, I mentioned earlier, I draw on the work of Greg Enriquez, who has a model he calls the unified theory of knowledge. And it's about the complexification of the universe from matter to life to mind to culture. And I kind of synthesized that with another thinker named Bobby Azarian, who wrote a book called The Romance of Reality. And he basically articulates that there's this cosmic learning process going on. And I basically look at is how, okay, well, actually what that really means, if you marry those two perspectives, is that there's information complexifying through time and sometimes leading to emergent properties. So you actually get novel layers of emergence. And so different entities, different kinds of entities emerge in the cosmos that are going to be processing more and more complex kinds of information. And so that's why the learning process itself complexifies. So, a single-celled organism is going to be learning with attention, let's say, to particular kinds of information in its environment that are relevant to its viability in a much more reduced way than like an animal will, which has to, not navigate 3D landscapes and intentional, domains, and even potentially social contexts with other animals and all this stuff, right? And then even more so when you get to the human level, where we've got this symbolic linguistic thing going on, where we've got these abstract things, and now we've got books, and now we've got literature, now we've got the internet, and now we've got deep learning and all this stuff going on. So learning itself complexifies, but the basic idea is that you have entities in their environments navigating them in order to sustain themselves and to maintain their viability and their flourishing, so that ultimately what these things want to do is keep complexifying. What everything wants to do is keep complexifying. The universe is a complexification machine, right? This is the story of the entire universe. Is through learning, complexification unfolds. So, and this is the last kind of point I'll make on this issue, which is that this is where spirituality comes in, because we talk a lot about transcendence in spirituality and spiritual contexts, right? Well, when you have these moments of insight, right? When you have these moments of the sublime, of the numinous, or something breaks in and you're just like presented with this new thing. Maybe you've done hallucinogenics, or maybe you've done some kind of meditation and you've had an experience where it's just like, and you're like, your whole frame shifts, right? That's a moment of transcendence. Now, what I want to argue is that what's going on there is you've learned something, you've complexified, you've integrated information from your environment about yourself, about everything else, into some more cohesive, emergent level that takes you up a level, takes you up a notch, right? And you're now operating at a different structural sort of home base, and now you have new affordances. You have more space, you have more capacity, you're able to have more insights and see deeper into the nature of reality, right? So learning begets deeper learning, and deeper learning, the way we see with AI and stuff like that. It's the same basic algorithm. It's anyway, we can talk about the mechanics, but that's the basic thing. So for me, learning is spiritual because it leads, or it can lead to, the complexification of the mind that allows you deeper insight into the nature of reality. And I guess, yeah, again, for me, it's sort of an irony that people who are often very interested in spirituality, so they say, will spend years or their entire lives sort of chasing these particular profound states of like, oh, if I just do this, or I do this, or I have this, and I'm not knocking these different other psychotechnologies. Again, there's part of ecology as a practice, but I want to argue that these things need to be integrated into kind of whole scale, kind of
learning frameworks.
Cohesive, learning frameworks that allow us to, like a new scaffold upon which now we get a new vantage, and now we can build the next level to that scaffold, and now we can get up there. So you see more and more and deeper into the reality. You get greater insight. And that, I think, is very much about what spirituality is about in terms of the transcendent function of spirituality and reality. And the last thing I'll just gesture towards, and we can talk about it if you want, is that if you can see that the universe is this complexifying, learning, algorithmic, I don't want to call it machine because that takes the magic out of it. It's this organism that is like this cosmic brain that's learning and growing and everything, right? If you see the world that way, then like that is sort of, you could say, this teleological drive or direction towards all of reality. And so to participate in that function of the universe as being an incredibly privileged organism with this incredibly complex brain, right? It's like we're just sitting on this thing, it's like it's almost tragic when you think about the waste of a good mind. So that's I frame this very much in terms of a sense of meaning in life and purpose, and why are we even here? I want to say, learn things, learn about who you are, what you are, because deep in that process, you might actually realize that you are the universe itself, coming to self-knowledge about your own self. So
I want to go into that other thing where for some reason people kind of slow down in their learning, or they stop learning, or like you said, we just sit on this massive mind. Yeah. Why on earth would we do that? Like, what would
compel us? Because we're lazy and it's easy to be comfortable. And I don't, it's like, don't get me wrong either. Like, that sounds judgmental. I don't want to be like, oh, people are just lazy. But like, I get it. It's like, if you're comfortable and your needs are taken care of, it's easier not to keep going, right? Oftentimes we are propelled by necessity. Necessity is the mother of invention. Karl Popper had a whole theory of evolutionary epistemology, in which problems are basically the origins of progress. So until there's a new problem, you're not going to keep moving. So as long as things are kind of working out pretty well for you, you're in a comfortable groove, you're probably not going to be, and that's also, that's, you could even call that a function of entropy, right? There is a natural law in the universe to the law of inertia, that things will follow the path of least resistance, the free energy principle, and all that stuff. So,
I think we call them
basically
local maximums usually.
What's that?
Local maximums in front of you.
Yeah. So, we're up against that, you could say. But I'll cite a statistic which I learned that I think speaks to this, and it should get us thinking, which is I saw that something like 41% of college students do not read another book after they graduate college. 41% of college students don't read another book. They do not finish another book after they graduate. Now, again, just imagine that, right? You're 22 and then you never read another book. And it's like your entire world just plateaus in terms of your vantage and understanding and insight, penetrating insight into reality. And for most people, it seems to work. Like they can get by with that, right? So, and again, I don't want to be moralistic about this. I don't want to make people feel bad. I'm just saying, but that there is a tragedy to that when you consider all that the human mind is capable of, and potentially the spiritual significance of like coming to greater knowledge about reality. But that's a kind of very disheartening statistic.
You have me feeling like an alien. Like I'm reading like 50 to 100 books a year. Like, I don't know if the number of 41% or so is the correct number, but there is some fraction of people who stop reading or stop acquiring new knowledge. And I'm here like rapidly devouring as many as I can most days of the week. And I'm like, I will never understand that person over there and what's going on. Like, it's very hard for me to bridge to them and know what their world is like and why they choose not to read.
Yeah, and I think that there's again, I want to temper my my rhetoric here, because I do also want to approach this with the requisite and important level of like compassion and consideration for what's going on there, right? Because there could be any number of reasons why. But I do think that it should also it should inform how we think about social systems, right? Just to be aware of the fact that it's slightly less than most, right? It's 40%, let's say. But let's say, even we'll be generous and we'll say the majority, I would need some numbers on this, but I'm assuming, I'm just kind of extrapolating from that given statistic. Like, let's say most people only read 10 books after they graduate, like that seems, because I'm sure there'll be some kind of precipitous dropping off after that, right? So even if you grant that, you're like, most people, let's say, only read 10 books after they graduate college, then you look at the world, it sort of explains things in some way, right? There's sort of like that makes sense a little bit when I look at how kind of strange and bizarre and messed up the world is, and how these mimetic warfare, blah blah blah, go on. And it's like, what are people listening to, and where are people getting their information, and to what depth, what level of analysis are people actually probing, that sort of a thing. The world starts to make sense, and the systems start to make more sense. And so I think that one, that's like that itself is insight, and two, we should approach that with like, I think a feeling of like tragedy almost, or at least compassion, where we're like, okay, well, what do we do? Because I think most people would also appreciate that, like, learning is important, no, like everyone's for the teachers, right? At least in America, right? Everyone's for the troops, like just default.
Everyone says
we're all
that,
for the troops.
But yeah.
But, so similarly, right. Everyone says, oh yeah, we support the teachers, and then we don't fund them and we underpay them, and, blah, 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 blah. And we don't care about education.
Most people that have
in America
been students also don't really like teachers that much.
Well, that's, So, anyway, I guess I'm just, I don't know. I'm throwing all that out there because it's like, education and learning are so deeply important to our social welfare, to our collective good, and to our individual spiritual development. And yet they are so, they're just withered on the vine. They're just underutilized, underdeveloped. They're just sort of atrophied, I guess would be the word. And then I think, it's incumbent upon us to meet that with both the normative urgency of appreciating the importance of education and learning, and a matching compassion to be able to be like, whatever's going on here is also, there's like the thing people say, most people are trying their best most of the time. Like, that's a good thing to keep in mind too. So anyway, I'm rambling. I'm just trying to, correct for the sense of like, because it's bizarre to me as well. Like, it's bizarre how you could just get stuck in the plateau So
Yeah,
I don't know.
sounds like a special kind of hell, like to be like in this, like, because I have been there where it's like I'm in this state and it's not like I'm not gonna die, and I but it's like it doesn't, and it's not horrible, but it's not good, and I'm stuck and I don't know what to do.
Treadmill.
Yeah.
Treadmill. Yeah, you're just on this treadmill.
Yeah, or even sometimes it doesn't even feel like a treadmill. It just feels like I'm in this like pit, and I don't know what to do. I can't get out. It seems like everything I'm gonna do is gonna make it worse. And like everyone advice is like every time I do something, like don't do that, it's gonna go bad. And then if I do that, it goes bad. And yeah, I think like at some points it's just sometimes I'm like, I don't care if this is a bad move. I will nuke my life just to get out of here. And then it's never as bad as it seems. But yeah, like digging yourself out of that local maximum that you get stuck in. And I think the learning, I think you're right, like that learning kind of is a safe way to do that, because you can just like sit and read books and you're not really going to get punished for that. And over time that knowledge accumulates and lets you see the world differently, and lets you like make more risky, dangerous moves, and it makes them less risky, less dangerous. The rationalist part of me wants to just go like, okay, like, so how do I maximize learning? And like, how do I even, but I guess like the post-rationalist is like, how should I even like come to think about learning? Like what is sort of like a basic framework?
That's great. That's a great question. So actually, yeah, you'd asked me earlier about like what's a practice that you could demonstrate or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And so like for me, a big game changer when I was growing up, I'd read books and I would think like, oh, you have to read every word, and you have to like, it's like almost as though you're speaking it out loud in your head or something, right?
Otherwise you
and that
read it.
yeah, exactly, right. And then there's like, and if you haven't finished the last 10 pages, then you haven't read it, it doesn't count or something. You have all these like weird mental things about these.
You don't get your medal.
Yeah, but I think it was actually doing like academic research that helped me kind of break through a lot of that stuff, because it's just not. Now I'll propose an important caveat here. When I say this, I'm talking about learning or reading for information. Reading for pleasure and reading for entertainment and art is a different skill, if you want to call it that. Where like if you're going to sit down with a Dostoevsky novel, like by all means savor every sentence, and of course you're probably reading in translation, but whatever, you know what I mean? Like the art is different. But when you're talking about learning, just like I want to get the information, you don't have to approach it that way. And so I think what's really interesting is to be targeted with your reading, targeted with your learning acquisition. You're like, I want to know X, Y, and Z. So, I'll pick up this book and I'm like, that's a honking book. Am I going to read all this book right now? Do I have to read it all through right now? Well, it depends. Now, maybe like this is a book I probably would want to read all the way through, because like this is seminal enough for a particular kind of strand of the scene that I'm in, that like I want to get this book so I know what's going on with this book. If it's more like let's say, actually I'll use this because you brought up Keegan earlier, right? So like In Over Our Heads is a Keegan book. They're talking about developmental psychology and all this stuff, right? Now, this happens a lot with me when I read developmental psychology texts. They have all these like case studies or like interviews or whatever. And like, I don't want to read most of that. So it's like, okay, I get what this stage is about. And then it's like, oh, okay, what's going on with Tom and Nellie? I don't care. Okay, Tom is at the garage and he's fighting with Jill. Okay. All right. Yeah. Oh, okay. And then, you come to a chart and you're like, the chart. Yes, there, the chart. It has like the pictures, distillation of the information. But now, of course, you want to be careful too, that you're not just sort of like, you're not oversimplifying or whatever. So, also, and this is key too, this is a big practice or ritualistic reading thing that I do, is underlining. I underline in my books. I'm a notorious marginalier. I mean, like here's Habermas's, communication and the evolution of society, and I just go to town on these things, right? Look at that. I have multiple colors of highlighters because highlighter levels now need to be leveled.
I never did that. I do like post-it notes sometimes if I'm like like just like keep like if I'm referencing something and I need it temporarily. But the
Yeah.
highlighting is like weird.
I know a lot of people have like a taboo also about, oh, you shouldn't mark up a book. But like if you are if you're reading a book to acquire knowledge, then give up this taboo of like the sacred object of the book must be, you know, maintain its virgin primacy or something, right? Like underline the things that stick out to you and then write little notes in the margins and you know, or whatever, do your system, but like try to extract the information, the wealth of information that like a mind like Habermas has already done the work for you. And then you're like, yes. And then another thing too, sorry, go on.
When I used to do like deep Talmudic study, we would have like the Talmud is itself and then the commentaries on the side, and I would be like writing I would write in pencil, but I would write it like fill it like the first time I'm learning, I would just fill it up with all the information that I need. And then as I'm going through it over and over again, I would continue to erase it so that by the end, by the end I'm reading it and I know all the stuff, but there's nothing there. Maybe like
so actually I like to do the opposite, and I haven't done this as faithfully as I would like, because but the best thing you can do is read a book and you write in the first page, basically like use a certain pen color and then say, you know, 2020 or something, that like the year that you're reading it. And then you have a little key at the beginning, right? So then that color is like, that was that go through. And then if you go through it later, so rather than erasing what you had commented on, you're actually adding to it successively. Because like I'll read books and then I'll be like, oh, that's odd that stood out to me when I read that book. And it's interesting. It's like you're keeping track of your own developmental psychological growth by being like, oh, that's interesting that thought was important. Whereas now I'm like, I wouldn't even conclude that in any way. So then you have like a little, you know, oh, you read it in 2023, and then you have a different pen color. So they sort of stack on top of each other. So that's that all this stuff though is like you're keeping track of your own psychological development in a way that is really real and in real time. And I guess one more thing I'll say about this, I think that is also really important is teaching is, you know, has often been remarked as the best way to learn. You don't have to actually teach people, but if you are writing something, if you try to present your thoughts in writing to another person to communicate them, that's a great way to do what I was just talking about of being a targeted reader, while also distilling and actually getting your mind around ideas in a way that is actually communicable and logical to other people. And so that you go through a book and now you're underlining, like one of the most frequent marginalia that I write is use double underline. And what I mean is like, use this quote. This is citable. This is a quotable line or passage or something. And if I come across that, it's deeply important. It's something that's it's something a whole perspective can kind of sit on, and I can use this. And you would only do that if you're writing, but the whole process of writing forces you to learn in new ways and to apply the knowledge and to filter it through. Anyway, so I could go on and on, but I don't know if this is, again, is this boring or is this fascinating? This is deeply spiritually profound for me, but I think for other people who are used to like probably watching this podcast and like talking about jhanas and, you know, psychedelics or what have you, this is like, I don't want to have like a craft. I
don't want to learn about jhanas. I just want to do them.
So anyway, stop me if I'm, you know, a snooze fest here, but this is, that's me.
Let me respond to what you're saying and then we'll address the meta.
And I'm I'm going to turn on some lights, but I have one of these things in my ear. Okay. I'm just going to,
that's so interesting the way you're learning. I'm just like reflecting like how that's resonating with me. I don't learn that way. Like I learn completely differently. And I think that's why I have such a hard time articulating stuff. Cause I do like general, like I want to know like, how does everything work and how does everything work together? And then I kind of, like the specifics are only important to the extent that they're important, but like you're doing this like this targeted learning and then focusing on the stuff that you can then later articulate, I guess, or you're saying writing, which is I guess a form of articulation. And I'm terrible. I feel like I'm terrible at writing, and I get maybe like it's because I'm not doing it this way. And if I start to learn,
I'll throw this out too. I mean, so I was just reading like Piaget talks about this, right? Like the whole And again, so Keegan's in this whole developmental tradition goes back to Piaget, et cetera, right? So like you can link those together. But like what's going on in that transition from something like pre-operational to concrete operational thinking is actually you're confronting other human beings and you are forced to justify your internal thoughts to other people. And when you are forced to do that, you find that a lot of what you'd taken for granted about your own thinking processes are incommunicable. And they might actually be based on entirely idiosyncratic mental schemas. You might have in your life seen a color and it related to this. And then for whatever reason, at a certain moment, you're thinking about something and you're like, oh, of course. And you're drawing on a particular relationship of mental schemas. And then you go to try to communicate it to someone and you're like, well, you know how, and then you're like, oh, well, wait a second. That's not really that. No, never mind. But you would never have that never mind moment if you were never trying to communicate your thought to someone.
Right.
So you're forced to be able to filter your own knowledge and ideas through the communication
through
bridge
the lens
or
of expression.
Yeah. And so that's why it's a deeply helpful thing for even just personally, like at an individual level, trying to communicate your own thoughts forces you to hone your own thoughts to a level of accuracy and precision, even if it's just for you. You can just write them down and then you're realizing, oh, actually, because, writing is just externalized, communication onto kind of a durable medium, basically. So you can just keep like a journal. That's probably why journaling is so helpful for people, because they're externally processing information.
I talk to myself a lot. Like when I'm learning, I'm trying to work something out. I'm like talking to myself, and I'm like, and then I can hear it. And then if it sounds good, then like if it sounds coherent, then I'm like, okay, well, now I can.
Well, I mean, this is what we're doing right now, right? I mean, we're three people having a conversation about something, and why are we even doing that? Like, hopefully, we are all enjoying this and finding it interesting. But why? Because like, there's something to be gained by trying to like, let's say if I were to say all this, right, and you guys were just like, no, what? And let's say then I was like, oh, and then maybe I go, this ends and I go talk to my partner. I was like, oh, I was trying to talk about learning. And then she's just like, what? Then like, and if I did that to everyone, I'd be like, God, I guess I'm probably just, maybe I'm really wrong. Maybe I'm really off on this, right? They would force me to kind of self-reflect. But what we're doing, and John Vervaeke is on this point a lot too about dialogos, right? What we're really doing together is mutually honing information because we're trying to conform better to the nature of reality. We're trying to like get more than what we ourselves can do on our own. And that is in some ways what language necessarily is forcing us to do, but even deeper than that in conversation and in these sort of trialogues and whatever number, we're trying to like get closer to the nature of reality so we can navigate it better so that we're in a better relationship to reality. So I'm doing that with you guys right now. And that's part of what this process is about. We're mutually learning together, even if that's just like, hey, Brendan's ideas are bullshit, or whatever the case may be.
We're not.
No, I know you're not saying, I'm just saying but that's an open possibility, right?
But we try to generate with them.
That's good.
I want to talk about because I think this is one way of learning, and there's probably like a bunch of other ones. So like trying to get categories of that. But I've noticed that Elliot hasn't said anything for a while, and I wonder if we're just
talking. Yes, I want to hear about it.
To put him in.
I'm having I was kind of doing nothing for a while and not really going anywhere. And then I had a moment, and I'm like, that was a big moment. I don't know what to say about that. I made a link. So I made like a psychedelic link. I don't even know how to. This is one of those uncommunicables. Oh no.
Oh no. Now he might not actually know it.
No, well,
Elliot, are you one of these people that only do states and don't do learning?
No, I'm kind of having the experience where I had a thing and I'm like, oh, this thing is a non-communicable, but it's like a secret to myself experience. Like, while he was talking about non-communicables, I was having a non-communicable. I'm like, oh no, that's a like non-transmissible. Around the observing of the shape of reality or something. And like, oh, I there's something about the shape of my reality that I can observe but can't transmit. Like, oh, this is kind of sad as well. Like, ugh.
I think a lot of the all like the fundamental learning is incommunicable, because you don't like you haven't grasped it. Like you have to be able to go meta on a thing to be able to explain it. Like you have to kind of like understand that you understand it. And so there's always like the deepest understanding is always incommunicable, but the like you might have this deepest understanding, and then there's a bunch of stuff that you can do with it, and then you can communicate like some of the fruits of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add, so like so you probably heard the phrase 4E cognition, I would assume.
For the number 4, the letter E.
Yeah, E. The E's are like, so they stand for embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended when they're talking about cognition. And this is like important for, developments and thinking about the mind and things that we've learned about how humans process reality, basically. John Vervaeke is like a 4E cog sci thinker. But anyway, extended is one of the E's. So what we do also with our learning is we have it extended. It doesn't all have to reside in here, though. Well, actually, AI is going to be probably a really good example of that. Is we kind of offload some of our computational cognitive necessity onto other things like books. There's the whole point of having a library. So I'm trying to find right now this particular Piaget quote where he's talking about these things. And there's a certain skill set too, and like being able to immediately conjure from your extended cognition a particular set of, a particular batch of information. And that too is also part of learning, I would say. And anyway, that's right. What just to explain why I'm going through this, but it might be secondary to our present purposes. There's a particular Piaget quote that I thought relates to all this. I know I wrote it down.
Yeah, you can look it up if you want as well. You can look it up after, and then we can put in the description.
Sure.
Yeah. I remember. I forgot that I was into this for a while. For he had Vervaeke was into this, like the 4 kinds of learning.
Well, that's slightly different. That's like the participatory, propositional, that sort of a thing. Yeah.
The P's.
Related, but the 4E and 4E cog sci is sort of like a, how would I put it? There's like a paradigm shift, a mini paradigm shift in some ways that goes on in the field of cognitive studies, where people start to appreciate deeply the importance of things being embedded and embodied, and that knowledge isn't just some computational abstraction, that it needs to be localized, all this stuff. I did find the quote, but I don't know if it's worth reading. It's like a paragraph long. So anyway,
a whole paragraph,
a whole paragraph,
a couple of those, and I've already read all the books that I'm ever going to read.
Anyway, let me ask you guys, is any of this actually landing am I doing a job trying to convey the idea that this is indeed a psychotechnology we're taking seriously, or are you still on the fence about this?
I'm going to turn that around at you, and we have a certain caliber of people that on the podcast, and this is within the realm, I think, of them. This is something I would expect you to be able to know, to have learned, to pick up by now.
As in to pick up if we feel positive?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I see.
As someone who runs retreats with laymen, I would expect that there's certain class.
I'm inviting you to opine on this. This is an invitation to give me some feedback on this.
Okay, there we go.
Hypothesis.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's what is that? It's acknowledging our own reality, I guess, our own system. Okay, so you want feedback? What feedback?
Yeah, I mean, what do you like? Would you agree with this? Is this something you experienced, or is this something that you feel like your audience would actually find to be helpful? Honest, even?
Yeah, to be honest, I think this is like resonating with me in a bunch of ways. One of the things I think I've noticed is that I think we've been taking this for granted, because like Ellie, when Ellie and I met, we're both like post-rationals, and you don't go through rationality without the ability to learn or the desire to learn. There's just too much of it. You're gonna burn yourself out really quickly and not get anywhere if you don't pay attention to your own learning process. And a lot of rationality is is paying attention. It's like the specifically the thinking part of it, but like there is also a lot of this like being able to know what reality is, and to be able to make decisions, right? Like, so like the rationality stuff is it's like predictions. Like if you're not predicting things, then it's not real. So it like throws that in your, like they very much throw that in their face. Like you need to be able to make predictions or you haven't learned anything. And that's sort of, I think, right, depending on how you use it. And like I think we both kind of use it in a more personal sense, which is why we're going down the psychotechnology route versus like some other people, they'll go down the like the prediction market. So they'll do this over a long period of time. So it's not they're not personally necessarily knowing how to, but they're knowing how to do this in like a bigger picture sense, or in like specific questions. So we I think we've taken this for granted and we just never really explored it.
Well, let me just say, can I speak to something real quick there? Is the predictive aspect is really crucial to this too, because this is also key to learning, right? Predictive processing is like kind of one of the mainstay theories about cognition and the mind and what it's doing, Bayesian updating, that sort of a thing, right?
Yeah.
Like basically the mind is a hierarchical information processing system that's making predictions about multiple levels of sensory input at multiple levels, right? And so, and it's only, and exactly, that's not the whole thing, but that's a large part.
This stuff is there's a whole controversy. Like the things you're saying can be very controversial.
But I'm not trying to reduce all of the human mind to, but a lot of what, let's just say, a lot of what the mind is doing is a predictive processing machine. Again, I hate using mechanical metaphors, but again, it's a metaphor. You could call it an organism. I mean, this is what organisms are, right? They're and this is also key to Bobby Azarian's notion of the integrated evolutionary synthesis, and the idea of this kind of cosmic learning process is that evolution itself is a version of this, but there's just this Bayesian updating going on all the time that goes on at the genetic level, and it goes on at the neuronal level. It even goes on at the level of ideas, and science is basically a large part of that. Rationality itself is like a good example of that. But
and like that's the idea that the crux of rationality is like Bayesian. And
so to appreciate that prediction is a really important aspect of learning itself, that if you're successfully making predictions about reality, then that is basically that's as good as we know, how would I put it, of a standard in terms of assessing what truth is, right? If you are able to accurately predict the unfolding of reality, then that gives you also causal power in the world. So then you become more efficacious. And again, that enhances your viability and your flourishing. So it's inherently meaningful. So it's not just knowledge, it's meaning. Like this is important knowledge that we have here.
Yeah.
And so people can do this at a fractal level, right? Like basically if I'm walking down the stairs and then I slip, right? It was like, oh, I forgot that last stair. And because of that, I was basically running this sort of unconscious processing thing in my head. And then my consciousness kicked in and my reflexes kicked in. And because all of a sudden I had predicted something that wound up being out of sync with reality. And now I'm in a rather dangerous, precarious situation. Fortunately, just one step, I'm able to catch myself. My reflexes kick in and everything's good. But that moment there where my prediction fails, I am then on the hook in an existential way. And that can have, real existential consequences. But basically, if I'm doing that more or less successfully, talk about things not being talk about things being taken for granted, right? When we get reality right most of the time, we're taking it for granted, all of the learning that we've already done, right? That's what learning is. We're basically just storing all that we've already learned about reality into our unconscious so we can run it as sort of an unconscious kind of algorithm to get us through life. And this is another reason why I think learning is deeply meaningful for people, because if you're living most of your life on autopilot, most of people will be like, oh, I want to learn to meditate because I'm living most of my life on autopilot, or I want to learn to be in the now, right? What they're talking about is, I want something more than just basically a life of successful predictive processing. And then you get flow states, and then you get challenging your perspective so that, and this is what learning does as well. It's a transcendent experience right? So you're challenged. And now you're up against a puzzle or a problem that you need to meet. But anyway, just to finish my point that I was making is that predictive processing is core to learning, and you can do this at a fractal level, so that at a certain level, just going down the stairs is a predictive processing thing, and you're predicting patterns and being more or less right about them. But you can also do that at larger scales. And then you can say, well, based on X, Y, and Z, who's going to win the presidency in 2024 or blah, 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 blah. And then, that's where the rationality structures that you're talking about really come into play, because you're talking about large scale predictive processing. And that's intelligence, in some meaningful way, among other things. Anyway, I just want to make that point because it's kind of cool, I think.
Cool. Yeah. So I feel validated there. Thank you. Yeah. So I guess so do you do predictions and stuff? Like, is this part of what you guys do? Like for us,
only for a fee.
Ooh.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I mean, we all do predictions. I
mean, like, do you do this like consciously, or is there like do you tweak like what, like, because like I think people grow up and they don't really you don't get metacognition until a certain age, and so is this something that you're like changing the way you kind of fundamentally make predictions? Do you have the group, the people you hang out with? Like, I know with the rationalist stuff, like the rationalist EA stuff, like we went through a phase where it's always like, okay, what odds would you put on that, right? So if someone makes a statement and people are like, then it's like, what are the odds of that? Or like, what percentage? Like, we're always trying to put numbers on it. Like,
well, this is interesting, actually. So one of the things I think that you come to learn is how chaotic and complex things are, right? And this might be, I don't know, it could be one of the reasons you're both post-rationalists, is because probably a lot of the rationalist community is maybe more in sync with kind of a modernist mindset of like, everything can kind of fall into a logical sequence. We can analyze it, we can interpret it, and it's all kind of like, logical and this, that sort of thing. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with the community or experience. What's that?
Except for the bits that aren't.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. And then it's like that meme or that picture, that cartoon where the guy is standing in front of the chalkboard and there's A to the straight line, arrow to B, and he's like, hey, see, and everyone's like, oh, this is great. And then there's this girl opening the door to the outside world, and everything's like a crazy jumbled mess of lines all interweaving, and she's like, what about this? And so I think the learning process itself gets to a trans-rational state precisely because it bumps up against structures and patterns that are beyond kind of human comprehension, and might be a deep, at a certain level, patterns might be an unpattern, if that makes sense. I mean, this is a lot of what chaos theory and complexity is about, is like, oh my gosh, there is pattern to randomness, right? Which is sort of like a wild idea. And I do think that's part of the learning process. There's a point at which the mind comes to rationality, and it's like, oh my gosh, breakthrough, insight, right? This is incredible. There are patterns in the world, and this can help us navigate the world, and this aids our viability.
Yeah, like you become a magician. Like I know the future.
Yeah, you think you do, and in certain contexts you do, right? If you're looking at the orbits of planets or certain kinds of linear systems, you're like, I got this one. But then you keep going, and then you're like, oh, actually, gosh, there's all these nonlinear systems, and there's all this chaos and complexity. And it doesn't mean that there's not order and logic and pattern to it. It just means that there's like a level of patterning that's so far beyond algebra, right? That it's like, it's this is what I'm talking about. There's a transcendent frame shift. You're like, I was taking for granted that the world could be compressed into linear equations.
But that it can be calculated, even the compression, I think, is people don't think about that math is actually compressing reality. It's
right.
Like there's a step there that people don't notice unless
Yeah. I mean, and there's a deep value in trying to find the compressed patterns of reality. But Elliot, you're yawning, so I assume that I'm boring you and I'm boring your audience. So tell
no,
you haven't said much.
Psychological thing.
I want to know what you're thinking about all this.
I am balanced on the precipice of reflecting on the spiritual path. So spiritual path, often there's something like you go up the mountain to the great insight at the top of the mountain, and you see it, and you see clearly all of reality, and then you kind of walk back down the mountain, and you have to return to reality post amazing states, post realization, post knowledge, and you end up sort of back where you started a bit, going like, I went on this whole journey and no one cares other than me. And so I'm kind of looking at the like pre-post relationship in terms of learning as well. Like there's some sort of desire to learn and know and be in a place of having known. And then of course I must arrive back where I started somehow. And that's just.
Yes. Well, all right. So let me link this a little bit to the sacred then, because I think that's more germane to this, right? But so the way I look at it is that there is mystery. There is this profound vantage point that you're talking about on the mountaintop, right? And there's a journey to get there, and it's often an arduous journey. Now, I want to say that part of the arduousness is because you have to read and learn and all that, but let's say it's, you had to stand on a pillar for 8 years, or you had to do a heroic dose of LSD, or whatever it is, whatever hero's journey you had to go on. There's an arduous path up the mountain, and then you get this insight from the vantage point up there. Now, I guess what I'm saying is that, to use a different metaphor, right? It's more, you can imagine that so much of the world is sort of foggy and misty and hazy. And then certain moments come of great clarity where you're kind of able to penetrate the fog, it clears, you see it all, and you're like, but then, you come back down the mountain, the trip wears off, the meditation, you fall, you come back out of, I don't know, 8th jhana or whatever, your cessation, whatever framework you want to use, right? And then the fog comes back, right? Now, the fog is the chaos and the uncertainty, the confusion, and it's what veils the mystery of the clarity. I want to posit that learning is its own way to cut through the chaos and the fog. It is what allows some of that vantage, and it's and that the experience of getting the intuition of reality at a deeper level is that transcendent moment of cutting through the fog and getting to a place that you weren't before, but at the same time honoring that there is this thing on the other side, that there's something else out there that remains mysterious and it remains sacred, but that the sacred intuition, the very reason why you feel like, this is meaningful and important and good and whatever else, is because it's drawing you to that more complex, more integrated perspective on the nature of reality. And I'm just saying that is something that I think could probably be approached from different ways up the mountain, at least, right? And I would probably say it takes many ways up the mountain to get all the full panorama perspective. But that learning is one of these ways, let's say, and it's a particularly powerful one because it's also the most durable, right? You can have a profound state experience and all of a sudden the fog lifts and you see it. But then when you come back down, it's like people who come after DMT trips and they're like, wait, it's like a dream they can't remember, But learning allows you to remember the dream. It's like, oh, but I get it. And I can communicate it to other people. And now it can get integrated into culture. And now we can collectively build on top of this knowledge and move forward together. And I think that, so there's something also deeply ethical about learning as a spiritual practice rather than, maybe just exploring state spaces as well, which can be very subjectively powerful, but might leave you in that space of, that was profound, but I have no idea how to communicate it.
I also see part of the puzzle of a substance or something that definitely takes me elsewhere is that I can always sit there and be like, I'm having an experience, but in my everyday life, as I read a book, as I learn, I don't have an excuse. There's no like, as I like suddenly realize that everything is different because I read this book, I don't have the excuse that don't worry, I've just taken something, I'm going to come down the mountain the other side. In fact, the mountain has come to me in some way as my knowledge, my like reality gets bent in some way. Which is way
like
terrifying and way more psychoactive.
Yes, that's right. And there's more responsibility there. I think that's what's kind of terrifying about it, right? It's like, you know, this is part of the challenge of a lot of the spiritual discourse, if we want to call it that, is that it's very easy for people to show up into it and just basically take some drugs or do some kind of a given, you know, aesthetic practice or whatever, right? And it's like, but it doesn't place certain kinds of demands on you. But I feel like what I'm trying to get at is that it really, like, there's a vocational aspect to this that's like really demanding, right? And it's not easy. And I think that is very hard for people too. But of course the spiritual life is hard. You know what I mean? Like it's often the case that if people are like, oh yeah, man, I, you know, threw back some whiskeys and dropped some DMT and I was awesome and righteous. And then I, you know, my homies and we did some LSD. That was wild, man. I had all these insights. We're like, this is not wisdom, right? And why? Because it's like, this is just postmodern, superficial, ephemeral, state chasing consumerism. Basically, it's kind of it's a kind of buffet of conscious states. So, you know, whereas, you know, Dana, you were talking about like Talmudic study, you know, that sort of stuff is like, that's like deep, you know. And even though some of these traditions, you know, I think all the great world religions have their own versions of these sorts of like deep learning structures and traditions, most of the content of which I find deeply problematic. But the basic idea is like, I think, deeply important to like move us into you talk about new structures of consciousness collectively being realized, right? It's going to happen because people do the active learning processes that deposit the learning and the knowledge and the conscious structures into enough consciousnesses, and then institutions get developed and so on and so forth. So it's anyway.